The world, in its second infancy, was a masterpiece of silence. Try to truly, viscerally imagine it. After 40 days and nights of nature's screaming fury, after the raging waves of divine judgment had completed their purification and receded, the only thing left was the quiet. A profound, pristine, almost holy hush draped itself over a planet washed clean of every stain, every memory of violence. Atop the peaks of Ararat, amid a world devoid of human sound, the great gopher wood door of the ark groaned open, a sound that must have been deafening in the absolute stillness. 8 souls, the entirety of the human race, stepped out from the vessel's womb into the crisp air of a new dawn. A rainbow, God's 7-colored promise, arched across a sky that had never seemed so piercingly blue. History had been given a second chance. The abominable stain of the Nephilim, the giants, the blasphemous fusion of celestial and terrestrial, had been utterly and finally erased into the ocean of oblivion. Everything was clean. Or so we have always told ourselves. For a time, it seemed true. Humanity, descended from those 8 souls, began to multiply, to build, to dream again under the silent watch of the stars. But a paradox, a terrifying inconsistency, lay waiting in the pages of their own future history. If the waters had been so absolute, if the cleansing had been so complete, how do we explain the chilling report brought back centuries later by the Israelite spies from the land of Canaan? How do we account for their trembling voices as they spoke of men of great stature, of a race of giants that made them feel like mere grasshoppers? For generations, theologians and historians have wrestled with this enigma. We have searched for the answer within the confines of the ark, our logic bound by its wooden walls. We imagined a genetic flaw, a monstrous dormant gene smuggled aboard in the DNA of one of Noah's daughters-in-law, a microscopic stowaway that slipped past God's notice. We have entertained theories of a desperate Nephilim clinging to the outside of the vessel, a lone survivor braving the wrath of God and water. But all these theories crumble under scrutiny, leaving us with more questions than answers. The Bible is clear. All who lived came from Noah's sons. But what if our search has been fundamentally misplaced from the very beginning? What if the key to this mystery was never aboard the ark at all? What if the answer was not hidden in the blood of humanity, but was embedded in the very soil beneath their feet? We have been looking up at the genealogies when we should have been looking down at the ground. Prepare yourself for a truth more ancient and elemental than a cursed bloodline. A truth that posits that absolute evil, when its physical form is annihilated, does not simply vanish. It seeps, it saturates. It becomes a part of the landscape, a stain on the soul of the world, patiently waiting for a new host. We are about to learn that the earth itself has memory, and in certain blighted corners of our world, its memories are of monsters. This is not a story about genetics. It is a story about a haunted geology. If you dare to walk this cursed ground with us, if you are prepared to hear the low, ceaseless whisper of a traumatized planet, comment "I dare" below. Our excavation into a secret buried not by water, but by time itself, begins now. To truly grasp the scale of what was left behind, we must first journey back to that chaotic, pre-Diluvian world, a world teetering on the brink of self-annihilation, filled with both wonder and terror. We must understand that the Nephilim were not simply large men, they were ontological abominations. Their very existence was a violation of cosmic law, a living embodiment of the profane marriage between realms. Scripture calls them the mighty men who were of old, not as a term of praise, but as a chilling acknowledgement of their power and influence. Imagine beings with the strength of demigods and the volatile, prideful spirits of fallen angels walking among mortals. Their presence warped the natural world. Animals would have feared them with an unnatural terror. The very air around them would have crackled with an energy of dominance and spiritual rebellion. Their laughter would have sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. and their wars would have scarred the landscape with a violence that made the earth itself groan. In essence, they were mobile centers of spiritual pollution. Their arrogance was so profound, their corruption so complete, that it triggered a divine response of unparalleled magnitude. The Great Flood was not an act of petty anger. It was a necessary, agonizing act of cosmic surgery to excise a cancer that threatened to consume all of creation. The waters rose and their physical forms were obliterated. Bone and sinew were torn asunder. The visible, tangible evidence of their sin was washed away from the surface of the earth. The world looked clean, but a fundamental law governs both the physical and the spiritual realms. Energy is never truly destroyed. It can be suppressed, transformed, or transferred, but it cannot be unmade. So, what became of the colossal, violent, prideful essence of the Nephilim? What happened to the torrent of dark spiritual energy that animated their hybrid forms, the rebellion that was their very nature? It did not simply evaporate into the ether. As their bodies were crushed under the weight of a world of water, their potent spiritual essence was violently forced downwards. It was driven deep into the crust of the planet, absorbed by the bedrock, the clay, and the mineral veins. It became a permanent, spiritual scar tissue upon the body of the earth. Imagine it as a form of spiritual radiation. After a nuclear bomb detonates, the blast flattens the city, but the ground itself becomes saturated with invisible, deadly fallout that lingers for millennia. In the same way, the fallout from the spiritual detonation of the Nephilim's destruction saturated the very soil. This dark energy, this echo of their existence, didn't spread evenly. It would have concentrated in certain areas, pooling in valleys where they had built their strongholds, saturating battlefields where their blood was spilled in rivers, and creating spiritual hotspots of immense toxicity. The water of the flood washed the world's face, but it could not purge a poison that had seeped into its very bones. The scar remained, silent and dormant, a toxic memory waiting for the right conditions to fester once more. Upon that cleansed but scarred world, the family of Noah stood as the singular foundation for the entire future of humankind. The weight of this responsibility is almost impossible for us to comprehend. They were the genetic and spiritual bottleneck through which all subsequent generations would pass. They were the designated carriers of the divine pattern, the template for a new beginning. But even the strongest foundation, if built by human hands, can develop cracks. And the first fracture appeared not long after they set foot on dry land. The incident in Noah's tent was far more than a simple story of intoxication and filial disrespect. It was a spiritual litmus test. Noah, the righteous man, the preacher of the coming judgment, showed his human frailty. In his vulnerability, he became a test for the character of his sons. Shem and Japheth responded with honor. Their famous act of walking backwards, a garment held between them to cover their father without gazing upon his vulnerability, was a profound act of preserving spiritual order. It was a declaration that they respected the authority and the sanctity of their patriarch, even in his weakness. They chose to cover, to protect, to restore. But Ham's choice was the polar opposite. He did not just see, he gazed. And in that gaze was not concern or compassion, but something else, a flicker of contempt, a hint of the old world's arrogance that saw vulnerability as a thing to be exposed and mocked. Instead of covering the breach, he broadcasted it. His actions revealed a spirit that was not fully aligned with the new world of order and reverence. It showed a resonance with the chaos and defiance that had just been washed away. Though his body was saved from the flood, a dangerous echo of the old world's pride had found a home in his heart. This choice created a spiritual fracture in the foundation of his entire lineage. It was a hairline crack, invisible to the naked eye, but it fundamentally weakened the spiritual integrity of all who would come from him. This is why Noah's subsequent curse is so specific and so terrifying. He does not curse Ham, who was, after all, a survivor of the ark and under God's direct covenant. Instead, the spiritual consequence flows downstream, manifesting in his son, Canaan. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be. This was not Noah lashing out in a drunken rage. This was a moment of profound, painful, prophetic insight. He was diagnosing a spiritual condition. The curse was not the cause of the problem. It was the divine labeling of a pre-existing fracture. It was a declaration that this specific lineage, through the sin of its patriarch, had forfeited a measure of its divine protection. They had become a people with a compromised spiritual immune system, and were therefore uniquely susceptible to the latent infections that still lingered in a wounded world. In the aftermath of the arrogant folly at the Tower of Babel, when humanity, in its effort to reach the heavens, was judged with the confusion of tongues, the great diaspora began. Fractured by misunderstanding, the clans scattered like seeds on the wind, each group seeking a new place to put down roots. The descendants of the honored Shem traveled east, destined to become the patriarchs of the Semitic peoples. The lineage of Japheth migrated north and west, populating the coasts and isles, and the descendants of Ham, specifically the line of his cursed son Canaan, those who carried the prophesied spiritual fracture, began a journey of their own. But their migration was not random. There seemed to be an unseen force at play, a malignant gravity pulling them toward a very specific destination. It was as if their fractured spiritual state was a tuning fork, and it had begun to resonate with a distant, powerful vibration emanating from one particular strip of land. They were drawn, inexorably, to the coastal plains and valleys nestled between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, the very land that would one day bear their name. It was a tragic, horrifying convergence of a vulnerable people and a virulent place. This was the land where the spiritual scar tissue of the Nephilim was at its thickest and most toxic. This was the hotspot of spiritual radiation. We can only speculate why. Perhaps it was a great Nephilim capital, a fortress city from which they ruled with iron fists. Perhaps it was the site of their final cataclysmic battle before the flood, a place where their immense, violent life force was extinguished in such numbers that the ground itself became saturated with their death echoes. Or perhaps it was their primary place of worship, a vast open-air temple where they performed their blasphemous rites, tearing holes in the veil between worlds and inviting darker things to walk the earth. Whatever the reason, this land was profoundly and uniquely defiled, and it was waiting. Like a dry sponge, it was waiting for a liquid it could absorb. Like a predator, it was waiting for a weakened prey. It needed inhabitants who were not spiritually robust, whose inner defenses were already compromised. It needed a people whose souls carried the same frequency of rebellion that it held in its memory. And then the Canaanites arrived. They came, carrying the curse of their forefather and their fractured souls unknowingly exposed. They looked upon the fertile valleys and the flowing rivers and saw a paradise. They saw a place to build a future. They could not see the ancient poison sleeping in the soil. They could not feel the low, predatory hum emanating from the rocks. They were walking, with smiles on their faces, directly into a spiritual abattoir that had been set before they were even born. The moment the first Canaanite families drove their tent pegs into the rich soil of that land, the moment their children first ran barefoot through its fields, an unholy transaction was sealed. It was an event unseen by human eyes, unrecorded in any history book, yet it was one of the most significant moments in the post-Diluvian world. A symbiotic relationship, a parasitic bond of the most malevolent kind, was formed. To understand this, we must move beyond simple concepts of good and evil people. This was a matter of spiritual ecology. On one side, you had a people with a compromised spiritual immunity. The fracture in their lineage, declared by Noah, made them like patients with a weakened immune defense, unable to recognize and fight off a foreign invader. On the other side, you had a land that acted as a reservoir for a potent spiritual contagion, the dormant, prideful, violent echo of the Nephilim. As they began to live in this environment, the process of infection began. It was subtle, insidious, and imperceptible. As they tilled the soil, the very dust they disturbed carried this energetic signature. As they drank from the streams, the water was filtered through rock that held a memory of violence. As they breathed the air, they were inhaling more than just oxygen. They were unknowingly absorbing the very essence of the land. Simultaneously, the land began to respond to them. The dormant echo within the soil, which had been silent for centuries, began to stir. It recognized the spiritual frequency of the Canaanites. Their innate human tendency towards pride, their inherited fracture of disrespect for divine order, acted like a key in a lock. The land found a willing host. This was not a one-way infection. It was a mutual amplification. The dark energy of the land began to seep into the Canaanites, influencing their thoughts, inflaming their passions, and warping their desires. In turn, their growing darkness, their increasingly violent acts, their embrace of cruel gods, their prideful ambitions, acted as a form of nourishment for the land's dormant evil, making it stronger, more active, more awake. A parasitic bond was forged, not between an organism and a person, but between a haunted geography and an entire civilization. The land gave them material prosperity, bountiful harvests, and strong herds, but the price was their very humanity. It began to slowly, inexorably, remake them in its own image, shaping them to reflect the memory of the giants who had been its first terrible masters. The Canaanites became the unwitting incubators for a curse far older than their own nation, and they were completely oblivious to the horrifying metamorphosis that was taking place from the ground up. The transformation of the Canaanite people was not an overnight horror movie. It was a slow, creeping plague that unfolded across generations, its progress so gradual that each generation likely saw their state as normal. It was a descent into monstrosity that began not with the body, but with the soul and the culture, like a slow-acting poison. The first few generations to settle the cursed land might have only felt a subtle shift in their character. They would have found themselves becoming a harder people. Old stories of their patriarch Noah and the great God who saved him would have faded, replaced by local legends of powerful, demanding earth spirits. Compassion became a weakness, ruthlessness a virtue. Minor disputes over grazing rights that might once have been settled with words now ended in bloodshed. Their forms of worship became a mirror of their hardening hearts. They built altars on high places, not to a loving creator, but to entities like Baal and Molech, gods who demanded the appeasement of blood and the sacrifice of children, a dark echo of the self-serving cruelty of the Nephilim. By the 5th or 6th generation, these inner changes began to manifest outwardly. The physical decay began to mirror the spiritual decay. At first, it might have been subtle things that were even celebrated. Infants were born larger, sturdier. Men grew taller and broader than their neighbors in surrounding lands. They would have seen this as a sign of the land's blessing, a testament to their strength and vitality. But then, a disturbing pattern would have emerged. These larger individuals were invariably the most volatile, the quickest to anger, the most brutally efficient in battle. Their strength was not tempered by wisdom, but fueled by a raw, primal aggression. As centuries passed, the process that began as a spiritual infection became a full-blown physical metamorphosis. The constant exposure to the land's spiritual radiation began to warp their very biology. This was not normal human variation. Men began to appear who were not just tall, but gigantic. Their skeletal structures thickened and elongated, their brows grew heavy, their jaws became massive. Their skin might have taken on a tough, leathery quality, and their voices deepened into guttural rumbles that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. They were losing the refined features of humanity and taking on the coarse, brutal aspect of the land they served. It is crucial to understand this distinction. They were not becoming Nephilim. The Nephilim were a unique, direct hybrid. The Canaanite giants were a horrifying imitation, a human canvas painted over with the monstrous likeness of the Nephilim by the artist of a cursed land. They were the ultimate products of a toxic environment, human beings so thoroughly saturated and warped by the spiritual defilement of their homeland that they became a new race of monsters, a terrifying echo of a bygone age, risen not from a demonic union, but from the very dust of the ground they walked upon. Centuries of this unholy symbiosis had passed. The slow, creeping transformation was now complete. The poisoned soil of Canaan was ready to present its masterpiece, its terrible harvest. And it was into this fully realized nightmare that Moses, guided by God, sent 12 men. They were the chiefs of their tribes, the best and bravest of a nation of former slaves, sent to spy out the land that God had promised them. Attempt to place yourself in their sandals. These were not cowards. They had seen the power of God part the Red Sea. They had eaten bread that fell from heaven. They had seen a pillar of fire lead them through the wilderness. Their reality was already steeped in the supernatural. But what they encountered in Canaan shattered their frame of reference and flooded their hearts with a primal terror that eclipsed everything they had ever known. Their report upon their return to the camp of Israel is one of the most terrifying passages in Scripture. It is not the report of military scouts. It is the breathless, panicked testimony of men who have peered into the abyss. They speak of the land's bounty, the giant grapes, the pomegranates, but then their voices drop. The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants. Contemplate that phrase. This was not a figure of speech. They perceived that the land itself was an active, malevolent entity. It was a predator. It consumed the humanity of those who lived there, and in their place it birthed monsters. And then they give a name to the horror. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. They used the ancient, dreaded word. To them, the distinction between a true Nephilim and a human transformed by cursed earth was irrelevant. What they saw looked like a Nephilim, acted with the power of a Nephilim, and inspired the terror of a Nephilim. They saw entire families and clans of giants, a society of them. This was not an anomaly, it was the norm there. Their famous conclusion, "We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them," was not an exaggeration. It was an accurate description of the power dynamic they had witnessed. Centuries later, this process would produce its ultimate champion, its most perfect specimen, Goliath of Gath. He was the pinnacle of the land's dark artistry. When he stood before the armies of Israel, a towering behemoth clad in bronze, it was the culmination of generations of this terrestrial corruption. And when he roared his defiance against the armies of the living God, it was more than just the boast of a Philistine warrior. It was the ancient, cursed land itself, finding a voice. It was the echo of the original Nephilim's pride, channeled through a human form that had been twisted into a monstrous megaphone. Goliath was the harvest, the living embodiment of the land's deep and abiding hatred for the Creator. With this horrifying context in mind, we must now revisit one of the most challenging and morally complex commands ever recorded. God's decree to the nation of Israel concerning the inhabitants of Canaan. When the Lord your God brings you into the land, you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. To our modern sensibilities, shaped by ideals of tolerance and human rights, these words are jarring. They sound like a mandate for a brutal, merciless genocide, a command seemingly at odds with the character of a loving God. Many have stumbled over this passage, unable to reconcile it. But if our theory holds, this was not a war of conquest as we understand it. It was not about territory, resources, or punishing a people for a different religion. This was a divine quarantine protocol. It was an act of radical environmental surgery on a planetary scale. God was not acting as a conquering king, but as a cosmic surgeon, and the patient was the earth itself. The Canaanite peoples, particularly the giant clans, were no longer simply a sinful nation. They had become the living embodiment of a spiritual cancer. The symbiosis between their fractured souls and the Nephilim-tainted land had created a new, virulent strain of evil. The disease had infected not just the host, the people, but the environment, the land. Simply driving the Canaanites out would have been like telling a cancer patient to move to a new house. The disease would have remained within them, and they would have carried the contagion to new lands. Worse, the original tumor, the defiled land of Canaan, would have remained, ready to infect any new settlers, including, eventually, the Israelites themselves. The command to utterly destroy was a tragic but medically necessary procedure to break the symbiotic cycle. It was the only way to ensure the contagion was stopped. The bloodshed, in this terrible, mysterious calculus, served as a form of spiritual chemotherapy or disinfection for the land itself. It was the painful severing of the unholy bond between a corrupted people and a corrupted place. This was a radical intervention to reclaim the promised land, to cleanse it of its ancient curse, so that it could finally become a safe and holy dwelling place for God's covenant people. It was not an act of wanton cruelty, but a desperate, agonizing act of planetary protection to prevent the Nephilim plague from ever again threatening to consume the world. It was the terrible price for healing a wounded earth. This ancient, harrowing tale of a cursed land and the monstrous giants it birthed does not end in the dusty pages of the Old Testament. To confine it to the past is to miss its most urgent and deeply personal message. The principles of this story resonate with a chilling clarity in our world today, because every single one of us is living on our own personal plot of land. This soil is not made of dirt and rock. It is the environment of our minds and souls. It is the sum total of everything we consume, everything we allow to take root in our inner world. Think about it seriously. Your land is the media you consume. The endless scroll of social media feeds, the television shows and movies that shape your worldview, the music that provides the soundtrack to your life. It is the people you surround yourself with, the conversations that fill your ears, the cultural air you breathe every single day. And just like the ancient land of Canaan, our modern environment is saturated with its own toxic echoes. The echo of the Nephilim's pride and violence persists, though it wears a different mask. It is the echo of insatiable greed, now rebranded as ambition and hustle culture. It is the echo of nihilistic despair, cleverly packaged as cynical humor and edgy entertainment. It is the echo of tribal division and outrage, amplified by algorithms that profit from our anger. It is the echo of lust and instant gratification, sold to us as personal liberation and self-expression. On its own, this cultural radiation is just background noise. However, if our own souls, like the lineage of Canaan, possess a fracture, an unaddressed wound, a secret compromise, a cherished bitterness, a persistent pocket of unforgiveness, then we become fatally vulnerable. Our spiritual immune system is weakened. At that point, the toxic environment is no longer just background noise. It begins to seep in. That constant drip of cynicism finds the crack of our disappointment. The glorification of rage finds the crack of our resentment. The whisper of lust finds the crack of our loneliness. And once it takes root, it begins to shape us. It nourishes and grows our own personal giants. The giant of uncontrollable anger that towers over our relationships. The giant of crippling anxiety that paralyzes our future. The giant of unbreakable addiction that holds our will in chains. The giant of self-important pride that isolates us from true connection. These modern monsters are not born of nothing. They are the logical harvest of a fractured soul planted in toxic soil. The final, powerful lesson that emerges from the dust of this ancient story is a radical, life-altering truth. You cannot hope to defeat a monster if you continue to live in its cave and subsist on the very diet that made it strong. Simply trying to fight your inner giant head-on through sheer willpower without fundamentally changing the environment that cultivates it, is like trying to mop up a flooded floor while the faucet is still gushing. It is a formula for exhaustion, burnout, and inevitable failure. The call to action, therefore, is not merely to be stronger or try harder. The ultimate call is to become a wise, discerning, and sometimes ruthless steward of your own soul's soil. It demands that you conduct a fearless and honest environmental audit of your own life. You must be willing to inspect every single thing you allow to cross the threshold of your mind and heart. The first step is the audit. Take a fearless inventory. What are you watching? What are you listening to? Who are you following? Who are you allowing to speak into your life? What conversations are you participating in? Be brutally honest about how these things make you feel. Do they leave you feeling hopeful or hopeless, built up or torn down, peaceful or agitated? The second step is the purge. This is the difficult part. It requires the courage to act on what your audit has revealed. It means unfollowing the accounts that consistently stoke your anger or envy. It means turning off the shows that glorify despair and dysfunction. It means respectfully distancing yourself from friendships that are built on gossip and negativity. It means making the hard choice to protect your peace above all else. This can be a lonely process, but it is essential. The final step is cultivation. You cannot leave the soil of your soul barren. You must proactively plant good seeds. Seek out wisdom. Fill your mind with content that is truthful, noble, right, pure, lovely, and admirable. Find a community of people who are also committed to growth, who will challenge you and support you. Replace the noise of the world with the symphony of truth and hope. Do not just fight the giants in your life. Starve them. Cut off their food supply by radically changing the environment where they have taken root. This is the ultimate act of self-love and spiritual warfare. If you are ready to begin this process, to take back your land, comment, "Cleanse my land." Let it be your declaration of intent, your first step toward true freedom. Your destiny is not written by the giants you face, but by the ground upon which you choose to stand.